Greetings. Welcome to the American Antiquarian Society's program with Abby Goode on Agrotopias. We're coming to you from the ancestral homelands of the Nipmuc tribal community who remain an active presence here in central Massachusetts. My name is Nan Wolverton, Vice President for Academic and Public Programs here at the Society. And since we have so many new faces with us this evening, I'd like to just say a few words about the American Antiquarian Society. As a national research library, our mission is to cultivate a deeper understanding of the American past, grounded in the resources that we house here. In addition to welcoming researchers from around the world to use the collections, both physical and digital, we host programs like this one that feature aspects of collections and the fruits of research, providing insights to the past and its resonance for today. And tonight's program is no exception to that. You can find a link to our website in the chat to learn more about the AAS and about our collections and our programs. Tonight's program is part of a series that we're calling Nature and the Environment, and you can find others in that series on our website. We thank everyone for joining us this evening, and as a nonprofit organization, we welcome any contributions that you can provide to help keep this work going, and we thank you for that. I am joined behind the scenes by my colleague, Amanda Condick, Programs Coordinator, who will be posting throughout the evening in the chat relevant information and information about other programs. We will have time for your questions later in the program, so you can put those in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen at any point throughout tonight's program. It is now my great pleasure to introduce our speaker. Abby Goode is an associate professor of English and Sustainability Studies at Plymouth State University in New Hampshire, where she teaches courses in American literature and culture, writing and sustainability, environmental justice, wilderness literature, and food studies. She has published research on early and 19th century American literature and the environmental humanities, with a particular focus on histories of population control, eugenics, and agrarianism. And she's the author of Agrotopias, an American literary history of sustainability, which was published last year by the University of North Carolina Press. Abby held a Kate and Hall Peterson Fellowship here at the American Antiquarian Society back in 2017, and we are very pleased to have her here with us this evening to talk about her work. Abby, I will turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you so much for that introduction, Nan. And let me get my slideshow going. I was just saying I'm a little rusty at this, so let's see here. Share screen and play from start. So again, thank you, everyone. I am really grateful and proud to be here. And thanks especially to the American Antiquarian Society for hosting this talk and really supporting a lot of the research that went into this book. So this is a talk based on my recently published book entitled Agrotopias, and I really look forward to chatting with you all about it. So I'd like to start in the summer of 2020 as the world reacted in outrage to the murder of George Floyd at the hands of American police. And here are a few of the headlines from June and July of that summer. Climate change is also a racial justice problem. We can't solve the climate crisis unless Black lives matter. And these headlines really reflect the urgent calls of anti-racist and environmental justice activists. They also highlight the interrelated history of racial violence and environmental destruction in the US. And I'm going to return to this slide at the end of my talk because part of what I'm going to show today is why it's necessary to talk about environmental and racial justice together. So the organization known as the Sierra Club, this big environmental organization club, like many organizations at the time, responded to these calls by publicly acknowledging its own racist and eugenicist history and really pledging to center voices of color in all of its future work. So here you have the title of the announcement is Pulling Down Our Monuments, and I'll just read the quote. as defenders of Black life pull down Confederate monuments across the country, we must also take this moment to re-examine our past and our substantial role in perpetuating white supremacy. And this announcement really called attention to the racism of early Sierra Club leaders, including founder John Muir, which actually drew a lot of shock and indignation from many readers, including Kim Stanley Robinson, if you read the comments. But even as white environmentalists today reckon with their racist and xenophobic legacies, even as they reevaluate figures such as John Muir and Theodore Roosevelt, the deeper and subtler origins of this history remain largely unexamined, and in some cases, they remain disturbingly intact. And today, I'd like to shed light on some of those origins. So what follows is really an unfamiliar story about the development of American environmental thought. And this is a story that goes all the way back to the time of Thomas Jefferson. I'll tell the story in three major parts. First, I'll describe what I've identified as an early form of sustainability rhetoric, and I'll also define my concept, this new term I'm introducing, agrotopias, which is a central concept in this rhetoric. Then I'll discuss an example drawing on Charlotte Perkins Gilman's novel, Herland, which I've identified as an asexual agrotopia. And finally, I'll briefly touch on agrotopian legacies in modern environmentalism, and really where this leaves us today, which is with urgent environmental justice imperatives. And this is the cover of Agrotopias. On the left-hand side, the cover image actually comes from the archives of the American Antiquarian Society. And I'm really excited to talk about the role of this image in the book. Found this image more in the Q&A, but that's the image, that's the cover art. So Jefferson had this vision. He had this vision of an agrarian republic, of a small farming, sustainable nation. And from the late 18th century onward, Jefferson's vision for many seemed threatened. It seemed increasingly threatened by urban poverty, by plantation agriculture, by population growth, and by reproductive chaos. US writers such as Herman Melville, Walt Whitman, Martin Delany, all attempted to rescue Jefferson's vision in their writings, and they did so by deploying an early form of American sustainability rhetoric. They promoted agrarian principles as antidotes to what they saw as really looming, impending population disasters. And in many ways, their arguments are not unlike certain strains of sustainability rhetoric today, neo-agrarian writings that advocate for a return to local farming, rural living, and land stewardship. But these writers, these 19th century writers like Herman Melville, Martin Delany, and Walt Whitman, they did not simply rehearse Jefferson's argument. They did not simply rehearse his vision for an agrarian nation or his argument that independent farmers make the best citizens. This is one of the things that Jefferson's known for, among many. He's a very paradoxical figure, which we can talk about more in the Q&A. Instead, these writers in the 19th century, they adapted and reshaped agrarianism to develop an early eugenic conception of sustainability, which is defined implicitly as the following: the ability to feed and breed a racially homogeneous, often white, American small farming population, even beyond US borders. So this notion of sustainability, which I would argue is still with us today, shifted, it mutated, and it gained traction throughout the late 18th, 19th, and early 20th century. And it appeared in Gothic novels, it appeared in Black nationalist manifestos, in presidential speeches, in eco-feminist writings, in poetry, in Herman Melville's ghost-written agricultural report, Walt Whitman's poems of crop renewal. It was pervasive. And these texts really depicted so-called racial improvement and selective breeding as the solution to population crises and the path to agricultural and environmental plenty. So this is a sustainability rhetoric that is really interested in shaping just as much as sustaining the American population. And it is a rhetoric that has influenced and infiltrated many environmental discourses today. And given this rhetoric's persistence Given this rhetoric's pervasiveness, it is no wonder that some early Sierra Club members were also prominent eugenicists, or that today the Sierra Club is working to pull down its monument, so to speak, amid escalating environmental and racial justice crises. This is where we are today. And these crises really require us to rethink our assumptions about the history of American environmental writing writ large. Today, sustainability advocates frequently refer to this history. They allude to figures such as Jefferson, Whitman, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau, John Muir, Theodore Roosevelt, and they call upon these well-known figures, these heavy hitters, to bolster their environmentalist arguments. They often suggest that we can all stand to learn from their wisdom. But these rhetorical moves in environmental writing perpetuate a false divide between environmental and racial thought. And they imagine that we can somehow isolate this admirable, benevolent US environmental tradition from the nation's racist history and from its eugenicist history. And I see this happening in some of the titles on this slide. I also see it happening at times in scholarship as well, when environmental and social justice or racial justice causes are almost seen as competing. So let's take Jefferson, for instance, right? Popular writers, and you might recognize some of the covers on this slide, like the Omnivore's Dilemma is really well known. Popular writers such as Michael Pollan and Barbara Kingsolver, they draw a line in their text between Jefferson's respect for the small farmer, he's so well known for this, and today's organic and local foods movements. And you can see here from this slide that these writers are lamenting that we've lost Jefferson's vision. We are no longer the agrarian nation Thomas Jefferson had envisioned. In Jefferson's time, cultivation was the king. In ours, it's multinational corporations. We're lamenting that we have fallen so far from the sustainable vision, and we've moved into this era of corporations. So Jefferson's role as a promoter of racial separation and selective breeding, a role that is well documented in scholarship, is really conspicuously absent from these discussions of his legacy, of his eco-friendly legacy. So there are, in my mind, there are two distinct versions of Jefferson that have captivated the popular historical imagination. The first is the so-called founding farmer. Right? The founding farmer, on the one hand, he's a founding farmer. Andrea Wolf calls him a founding gardener. And on the other hand, the infamous slave owner who fathered at least 6 children with Sally Hemings, all while publicly opposing racial mixture of any kind. And these two Jeffersons are rarely discussed together, but these two Jeffersons were one and the same. And this dual commitment to small farming and racial separation was actually not Jefferson's alone. And throughout the long 19th century, it really became the conceptual backbone of this early sustainability rhetoric. And here's how. So as writers used this early sustainability rhetoric, as they pleaded for an agrarian response to growing population, unsustainable agriculture, and burgeoning cities, they envisioned perfected new world sustainable societies as solutions to their nation's racial and environmental crises. These imagined solutions are what I call agrotopias. Agrotopias are seemingly ideal worlds of agrarian stability, productive labor, and civic harmony. And for many writers, they function as a comforting alternative to unsustainable conditions and to reproductive chaos. They are speculative visions that represent both the good place and no place. They are characterized by racial homogeneity and reproductive order. So as writers envisioned agrotopias, they adapted agrarian ideals to concepts of selective breeding and racial improvement. And I'll show you some examples of that. So agrotopias are characterized just as much by reproductive order and selective breeding as they are by land stewardship and small farming. Agrotopias are imagined elsewheres. They are geographically flexible. They're envisioned at different scales and locations, but they all represent attempts to escape or transcend an unsustainable world, often in ways that reproduce expansionist, exclusionary, and settler colonial ideologies. So agrotopias exist beyond the threat of environmental decline. If somehow we could just get away from this threat of environmental decline and resettle elsewhere, they exist in spaces such as the unsettled US West, the Texas borderlands, the eastern coast of Africa, or the heart of the Amazon. These are all agrotopian sites that I talk about in my book. Agrotopias are just as variable as the definition of elsewhere itself. So they can be hermetically sealed and small or carnivorously sprawling. They can be nested within US borders or as far away as possible. But broadly speaking, agrotopias are fantasies of starting over. They are attempts to revise and reclaim this long-lost agrarian ideal of New World abundance that Jefferson envisioned. And I should note that agrotopian visions also tended to overlook or misrepresent indigenous peoples and practices because they often involved imagining a landscape ripe for settlement, cultivation, and colonization. So I'd like to talk about an example of agrotopian thinking, Charlotte Perkins Gilman's eco-feminist novel, Herland. And Herland was published in 1915 amid a flurry of what I call progressive era sustainability rhetoric. And this rhetoric is defined by the convergence of eugenics, conservation, and a new agrarianism called the country life movement. And these overlapping progressive era movements linked the ideas of rural vigor and environmental stewardship with those of racial purity. So for instance, in Theodore Roosevelt's 1905 speech to the National Congress of Mothers, he warned of what he called race suicide. He encouraged the fertility of what he called average American women and praised small farmers as the foundation of lasting national life. And while Roosevelt's Country Life Commission sought to develop a so-called superior race of farmers, the National Conservation Association aimed to conserve the US racial stock in the face of seemingly troublesome vital statistics of immigrants, people of color, and poor urban populations. At the Second National Conservation Congress in 1911, the president of the Daughters of the American Revolution, and this is such a clear example of this, declared in one breath that we must conserve soil, forest, birds, minerals, and fishes, and the sources of our race in the Anglo-Saxon line. So this sustainability rhetoric focused on protecting the nation's natural and racial resources. Conservation of the race was a really common phrase at the time, against the rise of urban degeneracy and immigration as it was perceived. And the path to ensuring the nation's sustainability required the selective breeding of so-called native populations of rugged farmers and land stewards. So for these advocates, sustainability really began with the patriarchal nuclear family, with a private social and economic unit characterized by strict gender roles. Roosevelt argued that it was white women's national duty to propagate an agrarian race and really embrace their maternal role. And similarly, US conservation discourse relied on the ideology of separate spheres. Women at the National Conservation Congresses proclaimed a trilogy of slogans: the conservation of womanhood, the home, and the child. So well-bred future generations were seen as the nation's primary natural resource, and women's care of these future generations represented a mode of national conservation work and so-called racial improvement. It was all integrated in this way. Enter Charlotte Perkins Gilman. Gilman really provided a robust feminist intervention into this sustainability rhetoric. So beginning with her 1898 work, Women in Economics, Gilman argued that nuclear familial culture produced a sexual inequality that actually frustrated racial improvement. She argued that separate spheres and socioeconomic difference between the sexes resulted in degenerate children, hybrids, as she called them, of two excessively distinct parents. So sexual and economic difference was to be avoided just as much as racial difference in the road to population improvement. So Gilman argued that her contemporaries' focus on the nuclear family was actually at odds with the goals of sustainability, including the racial goals of sustainability. So for Gilman, a world without sexual difference is a world ripe for sustainability. Her novel, Herland, really follows this logic. It depicts an asexual, all-female agrotopia. It's a society separated out, really isolated from the crowded, polluted world. So this is a rural, nature-loving community that enjoys renewable soil fertility, an inexhaustible food supply, abundant natural resources, social equality, and plenty of room, air, and solitude. What more could you want? Herlanders are careful culturalists. They're conscious makers of the people, free from the helpless involuntary fecundity of the rest of the world, right? Unsustainability. They procreate through parthenogenesis, with offspring arising from a single parent. So you just imagine getting pregnant and you can just get pregnant. Herlanders are strangely clone-like because of this. They employ eugenics to propagate what they call a healthy and beautiful race, rid of all the morbid or excessive types. So because of this, they are a single, like-minded, ecologically responsible citizenry. So their selective breeding seems to actually facilitate and bring about their environmental stability. So Herland, and my argument is Herland recasts Jefferson's agrarian ideal as an all-female agrotopia, and it really reveals the eugenic agendas that quietly gained environmental traction from Jefferson's time onward. So Herland fulfills the goals of progressive era sustainability rhetoric and does so far better than the US. They have communal child rearing. And through this communal child rearing, Herlanders cultivate an agrarian community of skilled laborers, of spinners and weavers, farmers, gardeners, carpenters, and masons that all meet their citizens' needs. Herland adapts principles of land stewardship and agricultural responsibility to this eco-communal context. So the forests in Herland contain only fruit and nut-bearing trees. Their farms and gardens are in full production, and they are just as obsessed with ecological beauty, order, and sanitation as they are with careful cultivation. So the agrotopia is a highly controlled environment with so-called superior species conserved and invasives and undesirables exterminated. They're very clear about that. Herlanders also exhibit the rural reproductive vigor of Roosevelt's imagination. So they were, quote, an Aryan stock. They were white, but somewhat darker than northern races because of their constant exposure to sun and air. Whitman writes about this as well. This follows Roosevelt's theory of both blood and breeding of U.S. frontier stock. Herlanders are pain-hardened and work-strengthened by adversity. They are a toughened stock. So Herland is an agrotopia, but it's one that features, instead of the hardy yeoman farmer, the naturalist mother in loose-fitting clothing, if you can imagine it. But what I haven't told you is that this novel is narrated from the perspective of an American man, one of three male scientists who have discovered Herland in this novel. And ultimately, each of these men marry Herlanders and experiment with integrating themselves into this eco-matriarchal society. So in the novel sequel, which is entitled With Her in Our Land, published a year later, the main character accompanies his new Herlander wife. Her name is Elidor. He accompanies her on a global tour that culminates in the US. And she's never seen the world before, so she's encountering all this for the first time. And the two conclude that the once new world, the US, has really failed to fulfill its agrarian destiny. But first, the couple encounters underpopulation in Europe, agricultural underdevelopment in Northern Africa, and what they call ghastly crowding that she observes in Asia. For example, upon reaching China, for instance, Elidor becomes, quote, shocked beyond words at the vast area of dead country, skeleton country, deforested, deshrubed, degrassed, wasted to the bone, feeding no one. This is an image of unsustainability. She contrasts this barrenness with the image of productive farm labor, claiming that the population lives on the land like swarming fleas on an emaciated kitten, rather than careful farmers on a well-cultivated ground. So here, Elidor implicitly attributes population decline to the absence of agrarian farming. And that's a practice that, in her view, these countries have really failed to implement. Next, the couple arrives in the US, and according to Elidor's observations, the US population expanded incorrectly, not by natural growth of their own stock, but by crowding injections of alien blood, by vast hordes of low-grade laborers, parasites, bloodsuckers, leeches, and fleas. This pathological form of population growth results in environmental destruction, quote, noisier, blacker cities and drained, ruined lands. So for this couple, in this globally unsustainable context, her land represents a final frontier of sorts. It's the last possible refuge from this doomed, overpopulated world. So the couple leaves behind the US. They leave behind this agrotopia that never was to start a new, unadulterated race. And ultimately, surprise, surprise, in the final pages of the novel, Elidor gives birth to a son. So her land becomes the optimal setting for an agrotopian reboot, another chance, a fantasy of starting over. It's a new world emerging from this already abundant, reproductively controlled space where the American agrarian destiny can finally find fulfillment. So as you can see, this kind of sustainability thinking is not so much about solving and confronting ecological problems as it is about escaping them and imagining an agrotopia elsewhere. So Gilman's novels are really the culmination of a century-long literary effort to design agrotopian alternatives that become increasingly explicit in their eugenic and xenophobic agendas. So Herland is not just a reflection of a particularly racist time in US history, it also highlights the long obscured agrarian roots of contemporary population control discourses, eugenic environmentalism, and eco-nativism. And it calls us to question the seeming benevolence of some of our most well-regarded environmental ideas. As culminating as Herland might seem, agrotopian thinking does not simply end in the 20th century. It quietly persists and sometimes loudly persists in modern environmentalist rhetoric. And in my epilogue, I look closely at two examples of agrotopian legacies. The first focuses on wilderness preservation and population control rhetoric and how they work together. And this is really exemplified in the Sierra Club's This is the American Earth. This is a 1960 popular coffee table book that depicts a new world, an American landscape threatened by invading foreigners and sprawling cities. And I really describe how this happens in the book. But rather than envision an agrotopian escape, like many of the texts I examine in the book, this text indulges in a fantasy of renewal. So it really promotes a return to a so-called virgin American wilderness. And this book contrasts images of peopleless landscapes, vast mountain ranges and national parks with those of Indian bathers on the Ganges and New York City slums. So it really frames urban, impoverished, and crowded spaces as the primary colonizers and polluters of the 20th century US. And this is The American Earth, this coffee table book that I just discussed. This really reflects a particular moment, the rise of overpopulation anxiety in 20th century environmentalism. And this is captured most famously in Paul Ehrlich's The Population Bomb, published in 1968. And here I have a quotation from ecologist Raymond Cowles at the 1960 Sierra Club Wilderness Conference. "We as organisms have the capacity to continue reproducing until we resemble China, India, and other such countries." So, and I should also note that David Brower, the head of the Sierra Club, also wrote the foreword to The Population. So there's really a kind of intersection of overpopulation anxiety and wilderness preservation discourse at this time. And the imagined threat of overly fertile outsiders has continued, even today, to drive anti-immigration concerns about the nation's so-called cultural sustainability, which is also a phrase. And John Hultgren, in his work, Border Walls Gone Green, really demonstrates this. These sustainability advocates today assume an eco-nativist posture of protecting what they see as a pristine Anglo-European America, as they call it, from an overpopulated, racialized outside. And here's a really different agrotopian legacy. So this focuses not on population control, but much more on reviving agrarian ideals. Michelle Obama's White House Kitchen Garden is a project meant to reconnect Americans with the soil that sustains them. And Michelle Obama's goal really is also promoting children's health. So this 2012 coffee table book is a really interesting text, American Grown. It places Mrs. Obama's garden within this proud presidential lineage, centering, surprise, surprise, most intensely on Jefferson. So as a tribute, the garden established 2 Jefferson beds sowed with seeds from Jefferson's estate. So this is a quote: "Jefferson was a great collector of plant specimens and seeds. I like to think about those seeds traveling back to the White House more than 200 years later to take up residence in this ground." So it's really upholding Jefferson's role as a founding farmer in this text. And this is not a criticism of Michelle Obama, but rather a criticism of the nationalist narratives that the First Lady's office is expected to uphold and reproduce. So really locating this garden's lineage within this Jeffersonian context. And it shows how even today, just how easily we can separate out Jefferson's eco-friendly legacy, how neatly divorced it is from his early eugenic and racial thought. So on its own, Jefferson's sort of benevolent presence in neo-agrarian writings, like these writings here featured on this slide, may seem innocent enough, but Jefferson's perceived eco-cred, as it is called on the Sierra Club website, his perceived eco-cred enables agendas of racial exclusion and reproductive control to masquerade as charitable environmentalism. And this tendency to isolate the nation's agrarian history from its racist past continues to obscure the insidious legacy of agrotopian sustainability rhetoric. It also perpetuates the myth that we can somehow separate ecological crises from those of social and racial violence. And this is why today it has become urgently necessary to declare that climate change is also a racial justice problem, that we can't solve the climate crisis unless Black Lives Matter. Just as environmental discourses have merged with eugenic and nativist ideologies, so too do ecological crises merge with those of social violence, materializing in the form of the Dakota Access Pipeline, in the form of climate migration, toxic homes, and landfills disproportionately located in Black neighborhoods. Agrotopian thinking obscures and exacerbates environmental injustice. It stands in stark contrast to anti-colonial movements and efforts focused on protecting place, protecting the here and now, rather than fetishizing elsewhere. So to say that anti-colonial activists are not interested in Jeffersonian New World would be an understatement. Movements led by Ken Saro-Wiwa, by Chico Mendes, and more recently the Standing Rock Sioux Tribe, just to name a few, have sought to defend their communities against resource extraction and slow environmental violence. So these ongoing forms of creative resistance and place nurturing provide a striking counterpoint to agrotopian thinking. They define sustainability as place-based continuance rather than reproduction and expansion. They fight ecological injustice rather than fantasize about escaping it. And here I have a quote from Indigenous scholars Kyle White, Chris Caldwell, and Marie Schaefer, as they highlight this continuance it refers to Indigenous survival and flourishing in the face of change, including change stemming from oppression. This is a different kind of sustainability. So we have powerful models for grappling with these injustices, and agrotopian sustainability rhetoric is not one of them. Consider, for instance, I have here Vandana Shiva's paradigm of earth democracy. This is a concept that prioritizes ecological security and the life support systems of the world's poor. Consider Indigenous writer Robin Wall Kimmerer's account of The Honorable Harvest, which emphasizes ecological reciprocity, the gift economy, and the ecological commons. Consider finally Wangari Maathai's intersectional environmentalism, where rural women work to restore their ecological communities alongside their livelihoods and their political agency. So unlike agrotopian thinking, these paradigms and approaches focus on rebuilding the commons and staying in place, staying in the here and now, supporting existing homes and ecological practices, rather than imagining another new world. But agrotopian thinking continues to reverberate today. So what would it look like to rethink finally, fully, the many fantasies of agrotopian elsewheres and perfected futures, so-called perfected futures, to better serve the here and now. And I'm excited to take questions. Thank you so much.
Wonderful. Thank you, Abby. What a great presentation. You've given us so much to think about, and just why this history is so important to us today. I want to encourage our audience to go ahead and put questions into the Q&A. And I want to start, if you don't mind, Abby, by just asking you a little bit about process for writing this book. I know that a lot of our viewers are often interested in the process, the types of resources used. It's such a well-researched book, and I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how you determined which writings you are going to include in your chapters. I know you talked about Herland, which is really good. I know you included a lot of other authors as well. But how did you determine which authors you were going to include, besides Jefferson, obviously? And what other types of collections materials did you use to consult for writing this book?
Well, I mean, I could just start by talking about, when you research a book like this, you have your concepts. They work as your compass as you're doing your research. And my compass early on, going all the way back to my graduate years, when I first started doing this research and actually took a trip up to the American Antiquarian Society to do some preliminary research, the two texts that I became obsessed with were, of course, Herland, which I just talked about, and Thomas Jefferson's Notes on the State of Virginia. So on the one hand, we think of Notes on the State of Virginia as this text that's outlining the climate and the population in Virginia. And it's the first statement or one of the most major statements of his agrarian philosophy. And then Herland is known as this eco-feminist novel. They don't really seem to have anything to do with one another. But what I noticed was that there's eugenics and population control in Jefferson's writings, and there's also a great deal of agrarianism in Gilman's writings. So my goal with my research was to figure out, how is early population control and obsessions with reproductive control in particular, and who makes up the population, how is that intersecting with agrarianism? And how does that work throughout the long 19th century? How do we end up with such a profoundly eugenic moment with Roosevelt? So that required that I look at these long 19th century writings and notice, where does this kind of agrarian nostalgia pop up? And not in the text that you would expect, but in texts where we're worried about the loss of agrarian nostalgia, because sustainability rhetoric is a response to a threat. So for instance, I'll give you an example, Herman Melville's Pierre. Not many people think about that as an agrarian text, but Pierre has a lot to do with population decline and unsustainability. So many of my texts had to do with that threat. I consulted, when I was doing the Peterson Fellowship at American Antiquarian Society, I looked through a great deal of land reform periodicals in the 19th century, many of which I believe Herman Melville was kind of responding to and adapting in his text. One newspaper I looked at really closely, Young America, in the AAS collection, I observed across all that, and I spent so much time going through all these periodicals, there's this pattern of both agrarian nostalgia. We need to get back to the land. We need to get out of this aristocratic landholding system, but also a kind of anxiety about population that wasn't just about poverty. There was a kind of sexual anxiety there. And I noticed this pattern. This is what I talked about when I was doing the fellowship, this pattern that there was kind of an anxiety about sexual chaos in the cities and reproductive chaos. And that's chapter 1 of Agrotopias. And that's real. And that image, that cover image, comes from the Young America periodicals. I also looked at a lot of Black nationalist writings and Black colonizationist periodicals, Martin Delany's, Frederick Douglass's papers. And that's really at the center. That's chapter 3. And also a lot of stuff that didn't make it into the book that was at American Antiquarian Society, like children's literature and maps and treatises and manifestos. So it's really an eclectic archive, and I'm happy to talk more about that as well.
Yeah, no, that's really, I was going to ask you what you had to leave out. So I wasn't sure, but I figured there were things you had to leave out. That's great. And when you're talking about Melville and Pierre, obviously there's some connection there to his own experience. His farm in the Berkshires, Arrowhead, that must have influenced what he was writing about as well. But I love the way you've incorporated so many sources into this, and that image on your book is really pretty great. I'm so glad that you were able to use that.
So perfect. It's so perfect. And I remember when I was doing the fellowship, I think it was you said, you have cover art right here. And it turned out wonderful. Yeah.
Yeah, there it is. I want to make sure we get to some of these questions that are coming in. Mark Sturgis, who has been here at AAS before, is asking if you could talk, and you've alluded to this briefly, but I want to give you a chance to talk more about it. Can you talk about some non-white agrotopias and how they compare to white agrotopias? I'm thinking, for instance, about Cherokee agriculture as described by the likes of Elias Boudinot, or about the so-called Timbuktu project of Black agrarianism in the Adirondacks, bankrolled by the abolitionist Garrett Smith. On a related note, and at the risk of asking too many questions at once, it's okay, Mark, did you uncover any racially heterogeneous or pluralistic agrotopias?
Yeah, so for that last question, no, but that was because I was focused so much on this question of racial separation. Of course, they exist. They exist in the imagination of writers. And even if we go back to the Michelle Obama example, that really is a vision of a multicultural kind of gardening community and gardening nationalism that integrates immigrants, it integrates children. So I think that it is possible to adapt agrotopias to be much more heterogeneous and diverse, but that was not the pattern that I was interested in revealing in my project. The first question, though, about agrotopias. So I think it is possible for agrotopian impulses to be a reaction to injustice. And the reason why I say that is because the middle chapter, really the center of my project, is about Black nationalism and agrotopian thinking. And here I engage the work of writers Martin Delany, I think most prominently, also Sutton Griggs, and to a certain extent, Frederick Douglass, because they're all grappling in the 19th century with this question of how and if freed Blacks should integrate with a nation that has been so deeply hostile towards it. And in some ways, treated, the Black population as unsustainable. There's this great line in one of Martin Delany's writings that essentially says the idleness of the white man is sustained by the industry of the Black man. He really highlights, he kind of retells the history of the nation through this agrarian lens about how people of color really built the nation into what it is through their labor. But of course, Martin Delany really envisioned a kind of mass exodus of utopian freed Black populations building agrotopian communities elsewhere. So in some ways, even as he was reacting to the most unsustainable conditions of all, arguably, he was indulging in many of his writings in some imperialist rhetoric, in a kind of assumption that there is this elsewhere ready to embrace this population. I know he thought a lot about the eastern coast of Africa, but he also played with the idea of Central America. So these colonizationist forms of rhetoric, and there also is a kind of racial uplift and reproductive politics to it. Which women should come overseas and start these new communities. That was something that a lot of colonizations were interested in. Did they want single women? Did they want couples? Did they want mixed race peoples? So that's also something that I talk about. The reason why it's at the center is because it's so different from Jefferson's vision of freed Black agrotopias. Right, because that's really about upholding a white nation, not about kind of generating Black self-determination. So that's a great question. Yeah. Happy to talk about that more. Yeah.
We have a couple of people asking about other utopian communities and how they relate. So how do the agrotopias you talk about fit in or contrast with well-known utopian communities such as Fruitlands or the Oneida community?
Yeah. I kind of talk about this a little bit in chapter 1. What's interesting about this book is that the utopia of Agrotopias is never separated from the dystopia. So I have this moment in chapter 1 where I say, in this era of, Fruitlands and these other utopian communities, I think about like Brook Farm as well. You never think about something like Pierre or this downfall, or even, Walden, right? When we think about utopias, we tend to go to those communities. And I do think that there's a kind of strain of early sustainability rhetoric there as well. But when we look directly at those communities, what we don't see when we're examining them head on is, what are they trying to escape? Right. So if I were to look at those communities, and I don't examine them very much in my book, I would ask, what are they trying to escape? And if they're trying to escape social justice crises, if they're trying to escape poverty, if they're trying to get away from certain populations and try to recreate this ideal of purity, well, then that's problematic. I mean, I think even today about intentional communities and kind of that form of sustainability, what are we leaving behind when we start a utopian community elsewhere? And who are we leaving behind? So I know that doesn't speak directly to your question, but I guess the reason why I went to, especially in the first 2 chapters, dystopian imaginaries. The first chapter is about Pierre, which is really about the downfall of this aristocrat and this urban dystopian world. The second chapter is also about like the Haitian Revolution. I think looking at those dystopian imaginaries first is really important, because then we start to see why are we imagining agrotopias elsewhere? What are we trying to escape? What is the threat? So that's kind of why I look at the weird stuff I do. And I don't go directly to the utopias, although they were varying in their levels of success, if I recall correctly.
Great, thank you. I want to get to a comment here that Nell Painter put in the chat, just so I don't forget. She notes that she hasn't been able to read your book yet, but she encountered some of the ideas that you discuss in post-Reconstruction exodus to Kansas in 1879, when formerly enslaved people in Mississippi, Louisiana, and Texas rejected labor to produce agricultural commodities. They wanted to live and labor under their own vine and fig trees. That is, to be subsistence farmers. Their language was biblically inspired, so religious, not just agrarians. And she notes her book, Exodusters, Black Migration to Kansas After Reconstruction. I don't know if you want to comment on that, but I thought that was a really nice observation.
Yeah. So what's interesting is I'm sure your book probably overlaps so much with this 3rd chapter, because as I was doing the research about Black nationalism, of course, I encountered religious rhetoric. Martin Delany, basically, he kind of outlines an entire biblical chronology in his latter work, Principia of Ethnology. But this idea of Exodus, right, really underpinned a lot of that early Black nationalist rhetoric. Martin Delany as the father of Black nationalism. But what I'm seeing here, because I see your chat in the webinar, this idea of living and laboring under their own vine and fig trees, right? So the idea of sustainability as staying in place, right, or cultivating a kind of anti-colonial impulse, I think is quite different from colonizing elsewhere and imagining it elsewhere as a blank slate where you can start over. I think that impulse is problematic. It's problematic in today's environmentalist rhetoric. But what you're talking about seems slightly different. And I would look at that a little bit more closely. This is why that 3rd chapter is right in the center, is because I think that it's a both and. I think it's a kind of social justice and racial justice imperative with that kind of agrotopia. But I also think that it can have some problematic impulses as well. But I'll have to look at that more. That's really interesting.
Great, thank you. Cheryl Thurber is asking about native plant gardening and wondering where you would put emphasis on that. As a longtime gardener, she's emphasized native plants, but there are many new converts who are rigid, and the issue becomes criticism of nativars. Doug Tallamy's work, for instance, is influential, but many are more rigid and critical than Tallamy. who accepts a 70-30 mix for landscapes. And there's a tremendous amount of discussion on Facebook gardening groups, she notes. So I don't know if you want to respond to that. I know you spent a lot of time talking to folks out on the Humanities on the Go program. Is that what it's called that you do in New Hampshire?
Yes. So what is the controversy with native plants? Let me see here. I'm trying to find this on the top.
It's just, it's a criticism of people using
Doug Talamy. Okay.
Yeah.
70-30 mix. Okay. I don't know if I can speak directly to this. However, you should look at Michelle Obama's American Grown, because there is a section in there, and I've tried desperately to find the resources about how Jefferson was really focused on importing culturally diverse foods from around the world. So his kind of like how he picked out his seeds and how he cultivated it. And I just think that might be an interesting addition to this discussion about native plants. So yeah, I mean, I can't speak to that directly, but historically there has been an overlap between nativism and kind of this idea of conserving native species. So for instance, there's a group of eugenic conservationists in the early 20th century. They were interested in preserving like the Nordic elk and the redwood tree, like just specific species that were seen as the best. So those kinds of hierarchies were implicit. But yeah, I mean, obviously, and then there's the whole thing about invasive species and how they're racialized. And I can point to some scholarship about that as well. No, that's just fascinating. I just want to think more about that.
Yeah. Here's a question from Carl Little. Do you think that the soul searching of the Sierra Club and other organizations represent a new paradigm for environmentalism?
I'm cautiously optimistic. Everyone came out with these kinds of statements at this particular moment in the Black Lives Matter movement in the summer of 2020. So some of that is yet to be seen, but those concrete pledges to center people of color in their work, I think I'm optimistic about that. But yeah, I would just emphasize again that environmental justice, integrating social justice concerns into environmentalism, rather than seeing the human and non-human world as competing, I think are much more productive paradigms moving forward. And agrotopian thinking is much more about kind of turning away from landscapes that are perceived as unsustainable. Well, where does that leave places like Flint, Michigan, for instance? Where does that leave Katrina? Those are landscapes that also require environmental attention.
Great. Yeah. All right, I'm scrolling through and seeing lots of questions, and I may not get to all of them, but I'll just keep going along here. There's some great questions. Nicholas Helms wants to thank you for sharing your work. Couldn't stop wondering about the recent Telegraph article on Silicon Valley's proto-natalist movement and the accompanying discourse on the strong eugenicist vibes therein. In your work, have you found agrotopias in spaces where we might be surprised to find agricultural thinking?
I think that before I got really into agrarianism, I was focused on pronatalism. I don't know the article that Nick is referencing, but the one book that was really important in my work, Laura Lovett's book on pronatalism, really focuses on, in the 20th century, how rural uplift had a lot to do with reproductive politics, but also anxiety about populations kind of draining out into urban spaces and really leaving the country kind of this decrepit landscape. But yeah, no, I'd have to look at the article to answer that more directly.
Good, thank you.
Somebody's asking about the Civil War.
Yeah. Do you want to go?
Does the Civil War provide any relevance to the ideas you presented tonight? Yes, it does. The reason why I turned to that is because my chapter on Walt Whitman has a lot to do with his anxiety about the Civil War. The Civil War is a crisis of sustainability for the nation. So, Thomas Jefferson, Walt Whitman really, he kind of turns to Thomas Jefferson and the free soil movement as one of his solutions to what he sees as a great threat, right, which is slavery. And it's complicated, and you really do have to read the book to get into it. But I would say that the Civil War is another one of those threats that writers are reacting to and imagining kind of different agrotopian solutions. So yes, I would say the Civil War absolutely plays into it.
Great. And Sonia Di Lorenzo, who is one of our current fellows who is here with us from Italy, thanks for a great talk, and notes that these ideas are also very much part of the racial substitution rhetoric that we hear in Europe nowadays. Mm-hmm. So interesting comment.
Yes, yeah. Yes.
Let's see. Alyssa is asking, what, if any, role could queerness, identity, or theory play in the development of a more present and intersectional sustainability?
Well, I think it could play a significant role because much of the discourses that I'm excavating are heteronormative. Interestingly, even Herland ends with a kind of heteronormative reproductive narrative, and the first Herlander son is born. So I think that queerness in some ways, and I'm thinking about Sarah Enzor's work, she writes about the spinster narrative and ecology. I think queerness in some ways can really trouble this pro-natalist and eugenicist imperative that underlies this early American sustainability rhetoric that I'm excavating. So yes. Yeah. Great.
Look, Carl Little has put a link to a Whitman poem in there. Seems relevant to the topic, so you can
compost. Yeah. Yes. See chapter 4. Absolutely. Yes.
Let's see. Checking the time here. I think we can take another question. Thank you for your talk. Lots of people are have really enjoyed the talk. Due to some of the rhetorical issues, past and present, you've elucidated for us today, do you think environmentalism proper has outgrown its usefulness as a frame? And if so, have you thought about what new framework for thinking about human and non-human relations might look like?
Yeah, so I think about this a lot because so I just read Nicole Seymour's Bad Environmentalism, and that is about how environmentalist affects, don't necessarily always work. So she's exploring comedy and irony and irreverence in environmentalism. We don't normally think of irreverence in environmentalism. Environmentalism often has to do with self-denial, the moral high ground. Are you a vegetarian? Timothy Morton writes about the beautiful soul syndrome. Something about that doesn't seem to be working in my view. So Agrotopias is another way of trying to get out of the nature culture binary or the social pure wilderness binary that so many environmental humanists are trying to get out of, to find an environmental justice framework that really considers people as part of the environment. So yeah, I do think that we need some new conceptions, right? Resilience is now kind of a new moniker instead of sustainability. Sustainability is future oriented in a way that imagines what Stacey Alimo calls an environmentalism without an environment. So I'd say, yes, we do need new frameworks, and we're slowly building them. Nicole Seymour's book puts forth some really different, interesting ideas about that. But yeah, no, that's a great question. Thank you.
That's great. I love that you're giving us so many great book titles to look up. I've been jotting them down. I hope everyone else is as well. Thank you, Abby. This has been really fantastic. Great talk. I really appreciate your sharing your work with us. And thank you to everybody for joining us this evening. I wanted to just say a few words about some upcoming programs at the Society. Next Thursday, a week from tonight, on May 4th, we will host a hybrid program here on site at AAS. It will be also live streamed on YouTube. This is Rachel Walker, who will present on her new book, Beauty and the Brain, The Science of Human Nature in Early America. So hope you can join us for that. And then the week following, on Tuesday, May 9th, another hybrid program featuring Layla Phillip on her book, Beaverland, How One Weird Rodent Made America. Both of those speakers are also former fellows here at AAS and made use of our collection. So it's always wonderful to showcase the work of our fellows. So Abby, again, thank you so much. It was really wonderful to have you here, and thanks to everyone for joining us this evening. Good evening.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It was a pleasure. Take care.